Welcome to the first meeting of the Environmental and Utilities Commission. My name is Dan Mount. I am the Public Works Operations Manager and your primary point of contact. And Nanette Cordell is the clerk. As we do with every meeting, the first thing we'll do is we'll do a Pledge of Allegiance. We'd all stand up and face the flag. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Nanette, item 1A is oath of allegiance for public officers.
Okay, if I can have each of you stand and raise your right hand. And then if you start on this end, you say I and your first name, and then all together, repeat after me.
I, Sam Hayashi,
I, Alex Hirsch,
I, Yorgos Kazanis.
I, Karen Morrison,
I, Rohit Nayar,
I, Mike Vilhauer,
Do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and of the state of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
and the state of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
To the Constitution of the United
state of
States.
California,
to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of California,
that I will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
that
that I will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
And
Item 1B is the introduction of commissioners. I'd like to take just get started here and just go down the line and brief introductions of each commissioner.
my name is Mike Vilhauer, born and raised here.
Thanks.
My name is Rohit Nayar. I'm a local business owner, and I've been a resident of West Sacramento for the last 3 years.
Hi, good evening. My name is Karen Morrison. I work for the California Department of Resources, Recycling, and Recovery, and I'm a pretty recent transplant to West Sacramento. I've lived here about 5 months.
My name is Yorgos Kazanis. I'm born and raised here in West Sacramento, and I currently work for the California Department of Education.
Good evening. My name is Alex Hirsch. I'm a Deputy Legislative Counsel with the Office of Legislative Counsel, and I've been a resident of West Sacramento for about 8 months.
I'm Sam Hayashi, and I've been, my family and I moved here about 5 years ago. We've lived in Sacramento most of our lives and worked for Department of Technology.
Great, thanks. Item 1C is the election of the commission chair and the appointment of the vice chair. Is there any nominations for chair?
I move to nominate Michael Vilhauer, if he'll accept.
Is there a second?
Second? I second. Third.
Great. Commissioner, if you could move to the center seat. Oh, I'm sorry. Skip the part there. Is there any more nominations? And then we'll call the roll.
all in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone against?
Do I have to say aye as well?
Now you can move to the
There you go.
center
Now
seat.
you can move.
You can move to the center seat.
Now I-
Thank you. So at this point, looking to the chair to nominate a vice chair or take nominations for vice chair.
Oh, nominating for vice chair? Rick, for nominations?
Nominate Yorgos?
I'll second.
Who?
Yorgos.
Right.
Oh, you're, okay. We're,
Okay, good. That's good, you're in the right spot. That's perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm already in the seat, so.
All in favor?
all in favor?
Yeah.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Do I hit the gavel or?
Item 1D is presentation by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the commission. Lynette, are there any public speakers? 1E is commission communications. This being the first meeting, if you want to take advantage of that, we can. If
I'm
not,
sorry?
we can move on.
I didn't hear what you said.
Commission communications is the next item.
Oh, okay.
At this point also, if the chair wants to take over the agenda, we can do that also.
Yeah, let me. Oh, thank you. Okay. Oh, election, okay, presentations by, that's what we're.
We're at 1E,
Okay.
communication.
Oh, commission communications, okay.
That's if one of the members or commissioners wanted to comment on a meeting they attended or something for the topic for
Anyone?
tonight,
No comment.
being the first meeting, right?
None?
Okay. You can just move on to the regular agenda.
Okay, regular agenda, consideration of resolution 15-1, establishing the date, time, and location for regular meetings of the West Sacramento Environment and Utilities Commission.
I move that we accept the dates proposed.
A second?
I second the third.
Okay. good. All in favor, or?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Great. So. And. that's setting time.
Item 3 was removed, so we'll move on to the next one.
So we're going to consideration number 3, oh, number 4 then.
And we'll have a speaker on for number 4.
Oh.
Good evening. Tonight before you is a discussion regarding the alteration to the landscape strips. A short little background, there's been a few people that have come in and requested to alter their landscape strip and behind the sidewalk and back of curb. Some of them want to do it for various reasons, water moisture, from either over irrigation or the soil type or lack of drainage has created a problem on some of them, so they want to find some alternatives to grass in that location. And so staff, over a period of time, has developed standards to allow and recommend standards and policies for residents to amend that area within certain regulations, because there are city utilities that do run through there. There are city trees that are located in those spots that are maintained by the city personnel. So we've checked with all the various departments that would be affected by a change in the current policy. So this report and the recommendations are a cooperative effort amongst all the departments. Looking into that, we took this as an informational item to the Planning Commission at the request. The citizen came before them, and so they requested staff to bring it for them, and that was before this commission was formed. And the Planning Commission recommended we bring this forth to you for your information. And attached to the report is some of the guidelines that we're recommending in terms of how, what limitations, what type of vegetation they can place in the landscape strip area. Part of that would require them to get an encroachment permit through community development for us to review compliance with the policy, and there would be a next final inspection on that as well. Most of the plant material, we've also contacted our local Home Depot and Lowe's to verify that the plant material we're recommending is something you can actually get locally. And we're open to different vegetation that's on here, but it'd be on a case-by-case basis. such as you don't want rose bushes or something thorny that would, kids are riding bikes down, they would, run into. So with that, I'll entertain any questions.
Well, I have to admit, I haven't seen this because I wasn't able to get all the information, but without going through all this, so as far as the water issue, that was primarily from the homeowners or from the irrigation in the divider itself or the median?
There were a couple of reasons. One, it was muddy because it wouldn't drain, and the water from the house would drain down because it's usually around a foot or so higher. So all the water would drain off the grass if there's a clay barrier and would land in that area. Well, there's no outlet. It's just a square planter. It's a low point. He also wanted to use it for to drive over as well. So he had a different purpose. But then others want to do hardscape, eliminate all landscaping altogether. We still have a problem, even if you hardscape it, the water still is draining into there, and you also have a city tree. So there's kind of a couple different issues. Some just don't want to maintain grass. They want to have a flexibility of some low maintenance, bushes and shrubs. Others want to put some hardscape in there. So we've tried to give them a set of parameters that wouldn't impact the irrigation that's there, the tree that's there, and any utilities that would need to be accessed in the event there's a issue.
Is the irrigation provided by the homeowners? Is it controlled by the homeowners, or is it controlled by the city?
Majority of it is by the residents. There are a few occasions, and we have engineering here if you want to know more specifically, but there are a few instances that it is completely our utility, and Wendy from engineering can go into that further if you'd like.
I was just wondering, because it seemed like part of it was bent towards more drought-tolerant plants and reducing the need for consumption of water. And then I saw that the permit was like $106 or $107, something like that, to actually go through. And then there was a $500 deposit, and I wasn't quite sure what the deposit was.
Those are engineering questions. I would like to defer to Wendy to speak directly on those.
Okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Wendy Williams. I'm a senior engineer with the Community Development Department. The encroachment permit that would be required for modification of this area does include a $500 deposit. That's a refundable deposit as long as the work is completed per city standard to the acceptable level for the inspector. That $500 is refunded to the applicant after the work is completed.
But the $100 is still a permit fee
Correct.
to pay for the inspector to go out.
Correct. That's a fee to cover both the internal plan check for the internal staff and the inspection by the inspector.
I was just wondering if there's any way to, if folks are trying to actually put in drought-tolerant stuff and we're trying to actually promote less water consumption, to see if there's any way to work with that. So it's not as formidable of a barrier for people that want to reduce the amount of water there.
That's not necessary. That's not something that staff could automatically do. If the city council wanted to waive that fee for these particular types of permits, they could do that.
Okay.
So one question I wanted to follow up on the water usage, and I don't know who's the most appropriate person for this question, but you mentioned that in some cases it's the city that's irrigating these landscape planter strips. And so my question is, if the resident or owner decides to change out the plants to something that's more drought tolerant, is there a way for them to work with the city to make sure that the appropriate amount of water is being used in those circumstances, since they're changing the plants that are there without necessarily controlling the water that's being applied to that?
Yes, we would
System.
definitely work with homeowners in those particular areas. There is a subdivision or two where the city does control the irrigation within that planter strip. And if one of those homeowners wanted to modify the planter strip, we would bring in the Parks Department and work between ourselves and the homeowner and the Parks Department to figure out how the modification would need to happen for the irrigation in that particular area.
That's great. I mean, I think it's a really good place to be moving, to have this option for residents. So that's good that there's a mechanism for that.
Right.
Just a question, and I'm sure it's somewhere in here, but if there's lawns next to these areas, then the water issue is not going to be mitigated, especially if they typically water, twice or 3 times a week, I believe it is currently. Then you're still going to have a water issue if that's compacted soil, clay. So is there in here, since I haven't had an opportunity to read through this, as far as the removal of their lawns for more drought-tolerant landscape?
The general idea behind the policy was to encourage the use of more drought-tolerant landscaping. I believe one of the things that we had put in here was that all plants that are chosen, whether they're on our list or not, need to require less water than what they're taking out. So we are looking to have a lower amount of water used from the turf that's already in there. But even if they do so, as you said, it's not necessarily going to mitigate all of the concerns, because the water that gets into these planter strips is not all from irrigation. A lot of it is from the runoff from the homes themselves. And so if they're still irrigating up near the house or even the backyard, it all drains forward and drains into these areas.
So is there a proposed solution to that part of the problem?
Well, the city can only require what it can require. So the first area that we're trying to mitigate that is the area that the city has control over, the city right-of-way. And that's what these strips are. They're in the city right-of-way. We could talk about in-house, if there's any other way to mitigate the amount of water that comes in, from the homes. But the city will be limited in what they can require from the homeowners.
Are there any plans for the cash for grass, similar to like Roseville and some other cities in the region? Oh, okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. Paulina Benner, Environmental Services Manager. So, Mike, you know me well.
Yeah.
At this point, our budget doesn't support a cash for grass program. As you're well aware, I'm sure the executive order that the governor issued on the 1st does indicate that there will be some kind of state-managed program.
Mm-hmm.
So we're tracking that to find out how that's going to roll out. What does that mean to us? Or is there going to be funding available? If there is, we'll of course pursue that. But at this point, our funding isn't going to support that kind of a program.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Nothing on my end.
You have to indulge me in as far as what's the next,
Yeah, it's informational, and if there was any, direction, the commission so wanted to recommend as well, to amend the report, or any other advisements, we could, move those forward. If you like it the way it is, then we wouldn't change it to but it would only be changed, you know, if you're at your discretion or direction.
Folks?
I have nothing to add.
The only thing that I would kind of, because this is, I mean, we're in a severe drought, and we're facing some really bad water restrictions, that if there is funding to possibly pay for those inspectors to go out, and maybe reduce that permit cost to folks that are really going to be reducing our consumption of water, what that reduction of permit fee will pay dividends definitely down the road for the city. So that would be the only thing that I would add.
And I guess with that, you asked about the cash for grass, but do we know if the governor's orders for center medians would apply to these planter strips? Or is that still, we're still waiting to hear how that's going to be rolled out throughout the state?
With regard to center meetings, at this point, what we're looking at is the medians along public right-of-way. So, I mean, well, the main center medians is what we've already stopped irrigating. The regulatory framework that they have out right now is a draft, so we're providing comment on that. It doesn't, I don't recall reading that section specifically. I believe it's just related to the center medians that we would have in our public streets that we currently control. It may apply to some of the areas that Wendy referenced where we have control over them, but the ones that are under private control, we don't have the authority to stop irrigation at that point.
I suppose I have a question that just occurred to me. I was wondering, where exactly does the $100 or so dollars go into? Does it go into some sort of city general fund, or is there any way it could go into some sort of special fund that may piggy bank into a Cash for Grass program somehow?
There's a, part of the $100 is a $33 application fee that pays for city staff administrative costs in issuing the permit. The rest of it is called plan check and inspection. So it's actual staff time taken to look at the plan, make sure it complies with the guidelines, and for the city inspector to go out and inspect. So it's direct city costs that it's paying for.
Is there any educational component to these, to this policy to let homeowners or landowners know that they can make this change?
We haven't talked about how to educate the homeowners yet. That's something that we still need to flesh out. This would definitely be available on the city website. Other than that, we haven't come up with anything specific.
Could it possibly go into, I know there's the city newsletter that comes, City Lights, I think it's called, that comes out, could be placed in there as well?
It can definitely go in city lights. Like I said, we haven't really decided how to roll that out yet. We're still in the process of making sure that the guidelines are right.
Is there anything that Center for Land-Based Learning, are we working with them, with the city? That's like, you know, that's a significant patch if we look at all the homeowners throughout, if they have any suggestions or anything, any kind of program that we can utilize that.
I forget what's going on at the community center. Isn't there some training going on for landscaping and?
There is, well, yeah, there are some trainings going on through Paulina's group for water conservation classes.
Because I know they've been very involved with West Sacramento to get urban farms. So
Right.
if there was any kind of suggestions or any kind of plans that they might have suggested that,
Mhm.
you know.
We can definitely add them to the list and contact them and.
Because if we look at cities like Davis, a lot of the newer communities that are being built, Center for Land-Based Learning is actually adding a farm space just for the local homeowners to grow their own vegetables, own plants, so.
Okay.
comments or
I
question?
have one last comment,
Okay.
sorry. So one of the requirements is that the plants must have, have a lower water requirement than the current lawn. Is there any sort of threshold that you're looking at for this where only 90% of the current water usage is
There's-
better but not great, or?
Right. There's no stated threshold. Part of, one of the things that we were thinking of is that most of the areas still have lawn, but some people have already changed out their lawn to something else. And if we set a specific threshold, we don't really want to punish people because they already traded it out for something that's a little less anyway. So we didn't set that threshold.
Is that something that's going to be looked at later as far as the threshold, or we're just going to set it at lower?
Well, like I said, right now, we decided to just say it needs to be lower.
Okay.
That's definitely something we could look into, especially after we get this rolling and seeing how it's working. Maybe at that point, then it does warrant setting an absolute threshold.
Of either total water usage, or, I can see why you wouldn't want to do a percentage decrease from the current usage, but to say however many gallons per square foot, to set a threshold in that way instead, so that you aren't penalizing people who've already taken some steps, but you're also incentivizing further action to reduce water usage. But again, I think this is a good framework to start with for getting this new system in place, so.
Okay?
Okay, if there's no further comments, we can move on, or is it?
Okay. Do we go to number 5, or we?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, public workshop regarding proposed general plan, policy amendments regarding to flood protection. Is that?
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is David Tilley. I'm the Principal Planner in the city's Community Development Department. And I'm here tonight to discuss our proposed new general plan policies related to flood protection that'll help us comply with some very significant package of state legislation that has been passed in the last several years. Most notably was SB 5. We are under the deadline to comply with SB 5, which in this case means getting certain policies into our general plan, and so we've presented those draft policies for your consideration tonight. We've already been to the Planning Commission on this, as their sort of the meeting schedule has rolled around, and now that your commission is now here and established, we want to get your input on those as well. Just by way of background, the city has been in the process of updating its general plan comprehensively for the last several years. And this is sort of a subset of that effort because we are under this July statutory deadline to have this complete. So what we will be doing is we'll actually be taking these new policies, putting them into our current general plan, and then once the overall general plan update is done toward the end of the year, we'll carry them over, into that. So your first attachment provided to you is sort of an FAQ that was put out by DWR, who's sort of tasked with providing guidance to local governments about this. So this provides some background as to what DWR is looking for in this legislation. And however, it remains up to us as the local government level to come up with the actual final language on the policies. The guidance from DWR is very helpful, but it doesn't necessarily go all the way in terms of essentially telling you exactly what they need. So we have worked with our consultants, and we've looked at also in City of Sacramento, who's been also updating its general plan and has been several months ahead of us, and is to also comply with SB 5. So we feel like that we are definitely in the target range of where we need to be. We also have the environmental document for this particular general plan amendment on the street right now. We're seeking formal comments through that channel. So if I can direct your attention to attachment 2. These are the draft policies that we want to integrate into our existing safety element of our general plan. The policies are fairly broad, which is how a general plan typically is done. The temptation is to always get a lot more specific and sometimes have to, reel back from that. The general plan is definitely more of the broader, long-term guiding policy document for the city that's implemented via other means. Once this is done, for example, we'll need to update our zoning ordinance and some other stuff in our municipal code to help implement these policies in the more day-to-day, world. So many of these policies we have in here are somewhat similar to the ones we have on the books and the things we have been doing already. 200-year flood protection is already our goal. We amended our general plan several years ago for that. We certainly are and have been cooperating with many of the other agencies that are involved in flood protection, with our own WSAFCA, with DWR, the Corps, and others. We are, having our, making sure that our new land use element as it goes forward is complying with this, that we're making sure we keep the current, floodplain data that's in there that DWR has produced. We are working with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board on any levee and floodway if there's any encroachments in those areas. An important one that I think especially for your particular commission is there has been a lot of discussion amongst the Corps about whether trees on levees are good or bad. And we believe that, the trees along the levee help provide for habitat. They especially help shade the water, which is very important for young fish species. And so we very much want to be on board in our policy document to the extent the Corps permits it, that, we don't want to see the levees completely denuded. And this has been a big debate, and that's still unresolved at this moment, where that's ultimately going to go. But that is something that, at least from our regional perspective, we believe remains very important. And we, of course, we want to make sure that our levees provide the safety that we need. Again, the 200-year level protection is important, even though 100 years is only the requirement. We want to go to 200-year. I believe it's better for our community. It's better for flood insurance rates. And the extra increment to get to 200-year from 100-year is not that significant. It's not like doubling it, and as it might apply. So we want to maintain a 200-year level protection as our main goal. So tonight we're seeking your input on some of these on the policies. We'll obviously look to take any public comment, should there be any this evening. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any current projects that are going to be affected by this?
Many of these things are in here are matters that we're working on sort of already and are in practice. We need to make sure they're, clearly, spelled out in our general plan, however. So this does not change any developments or proposed developments. We still need to be, following and working closely with our partners. We've been very careful about that. We don't want to become another Natomas. So the short answer is that projects will still be able to proceed because many of these, requirements and things are things that sort of exist already.
So you mentioned that many of these are similar to what's in the current plan. Are the points that you spoke on the primary differences between this and the current plan?
Well, yeah. Well, our general plan now speaks to flooding, but it's very limited, other than the 200-year requirement. Mm-hmm. So this really sort of expands along a lot more than what we have in there, presently. A lot of stuff about the levees themselves, the levee trees. And then, access to levees, all those, that's just a level of detail that we don't have in there yet. So we're really sort of building upon what we've have had in there historically, and then added, 5 or 6 years ago, as this, flooding issue in our community really became evident that this was serious business. And so we build upon that, and as the guidance has come out from DWR on this, that's where we started taking it to this level.
As far as the port and the levees, is that part of this? I mean, as far as the trees, for example, and up and down through the channel?
Yeah, the port has its navigation levees, as well. And my understanding is ultimately those may need some improvements as well. But the primary focus is on the river levees at this time around our community. But our community is completely ringed by levees, both on the perimeter and then also internally. So everything that we're doing in here is for sort of all levies, overall.
You mentioned that there's currently some discussion about the levee trees, and I know that there's a lot of development along the riverfront in the Pioneer Bluffs district and the Stonegate district, since I drive through it every day. And I was wondering, is the discussion about levee trees right now that there should be no trees at all, so there's a riverfront view, that there should be some trees, or that there should be a lot of trees?
Well, this has been debated quite a bit over the last few years, and a lot of it started with the Corps out of DC, stating that, trees on levees are bad because trees die, and then that creates holes in the levees. Animals can get in, and it can affect the, structural integrity of the levees. From our regional perspective, we certainly recognize that potential. We also recognize that trees can potentially even strengthen levees, and then also, of course, they afford the habitat, riparian habitat that we need. So, the Bridge District is a, unique animal because it doesn't have a typical levee profile. It's sort of built-up land in there, but we obviously need to be very careful about any tree removal along those riparian corridors because they do provide nesting habitat for some, migratory birds. And we also, believe that the trees are part of the natural environment, and the development is trying to work with that natural environment in those areas.
Is there a timeframe at which the Corps is going to make a final decision on tree or no tree, or?
Yeah, I'm not aware of if there is a time frame. I know this question came up when we were at the Planning Commission recently, and we had our WSAFCO representative here at that time, and this remains an unresolved issue at this time. But
If they were to determine that the trees are not appropriate, would trees that are along current levees be taken out, or would it just be all future levees would?
no, I believe what we'll be referring to is existing trees. You typically would not go out now and plant new trees, on the levee itself, but obviously there's a lot of riparian habitat along the river and lots of trees. So I believe there's support on this from the regional version of the Corps. It's a matter of, it does the headquarters in DC, see it that way too.
What's the completion or percentage of completion of the 200-year levee system?
Well, WSAFCA has done some small projects along around various areas in the city, along, near the Ice Street Bridge and some out by the CHP Academy. They have not begun the stuff in Southport along the Sacramento River levee yet. The Corps did a small project kind of at the northeast corner in the Stone Lock area that just finished. But WSAFCA will probably begin that levee work next year, and I think it's about 6 miles worth of levee, so it will take several years to complete.
Are they going to fully smooth out that section where the old levee was?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture of solutions. In some cases, they will degrade the existing levee and to allow for seasonal inundation, and then actually construct a setback levee, essentially a whole new levee behind it. In a few places, they will actually, especially when there's a lot of existing development adjacent to it, they will put in what's known as a slurry wall in those areas. But for the most part, we are talking about a setback levee that will be substantially larger than what we have out there right now, and will change the landscape, quite a bit.
So is that what's going on the newly opened portion of South River Road? I see some.
Yeah, the Corps just finished a project there, right around sort of the bend in the river right there, and they reopened South River Road. That had been ongoing for several years. But that was definitely new levee work that the Corps was responsible for there. WSAFCA, which is the joint powers agency between the city and RD 900, will be doing a much larger levee project, but similar to that throughout the rest of it. Just where that project stops, they will keep going around the rest of our levee. And this would be a significant construction project.
Are any of the roads going to be updated? I noticed in that report that it said that none of the levee roads were supposed to be main arterial roads for evacuation or anything. Yeah, the road that's on top of the levee now, South River Road, as we know it today, will no longer, exist. Village Parkway, which in the Southport Framework Plan has always been planned to replace sort of the function of South River Road from a, day-to-day circulation standpoint. And what's one of the first things that WSAFCA will be doing is actually constructing an interim version of Village Parkway, starting where Village Parkway stops right now, which is at Lake Washington, and they will bring it all the way south and around the sort of the bottom of Southport and tying in all the way into Gregory.
So that's an interim version of that they will build. That will be one of the first things they build potentially this year.
Oh, this year, really?
Yeah, start probably later this year. Because they need that before they can take the existing South River Road out of commission.
So there was, any new development had to not be forced to go through the levee roads, I noticed in that.
We've always wanted to take away vehicular traffic off South River Road, long before, the flooding issues, became apparent. And that's sort of what Village Parkway sort of replaces that, because it sort of it also parallels the river. But the levee road that's up there now in the future will primarily only provide access to the marinas. It will not be a through road anymore.
Okay. So it will be blocked off somewhere?
Yes. And so it will, just south of, once the West Africa starts its project, which will pick up right where the core project just finished, it will no longer go through.
Okay.
So I was taking a look at the 200-year floodplain area before coming here, and I was surprised to see the area that I live in is not considered in the 200-year floodplain. So I'm in the more northern part of West Sacramento. And I'm curious as to how up-to-date the 200-year floodplain projections are. As we have more extreme weather events with climate change and everything else, I imagine it's going to affect what our projections look like for.
Yeah, you're right, and
floodplain
that's
projections.
one of our goals here is, DWR is producing those maps, so we will need to continue to keep them, the most current versions, available in our general plan. You mentioned climate change. That is a big factor in this. That's sort of a wild card, because it's not particularly well understood, what the impacts of climate change will be in 30, 40, 50, 100 years. But we have referenced that, as one of our policies, in here is addressing how climate change needs to be accounted for, and doing some resiliency planning is sort of the latest term now, because it's sort of, if it goes on the premise that climate change is already happening, so therefore it's more at how you're going to respond to it. If you just take it that it is already occurring.
So are we building into this plan a timely review of the 200-year floodplain, so as to try to get ahead of that? So
yeah, that will be one of the implementation, measures on that as we continue to, our goal is, once we have our overall general plan done, is to keep it, do a lot more maintenance on it than we have done historically. We should not be doing a comprehensive update like every quarter century. It needs to be done, probably like on a 5-year cycle, ideally.
But that will completely depend on DWR and their funding and their schedule.
Well, that's part of it as well, and we've done some of our own modeling, out there, so the information is there, and so this is what DWR does, and so we don't expect our thing to change, radically, but over time, the climate change is really the biggest one that we have to be mindful of, because that will sort of change things as we have known them to be.
apart from the issue of the trees on the levee, does the proposal here pretty much match what DWR is recommending?
Yeah, we
for
believe so.
the
This
roads?
is before them right now, and they're reviewing it as part of the environmental document. We sort of let some of the other communities in the region be somewhat of the guinea pig on this, and so we have sort of tracked how they have done things and how it has passed muster in other communities. So we believe we are tracking on this well, and even though DWR does not have to formally approve this, we'd certainly like at least a thumbs up or something that shows we're going in the right direction.
Does the levee trees issue have to be resolved before your July deadline?
No, that's a bigger issue than just us. That's, much more of a, nationwide issue, and it's unknown when that will be resolved. But our point is that we do not want to see the levees, denuded.
Any more comments, questions? Thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you.
We're going to number 6, public workshop on the second administrative draft of the YOLO Habitat Conservation Plan and Natural Community Conservation Plan.
Bear with me. Commissioners, as I have quite a bit of material here. I want to get organized. All right. Good evening, Chairman Vilhauer and members of the Environment and Utilities Commission. We're very glad to have you. I am Charlene Hamilton. I'm the Community Development Director, and I'm going to be presenting this item this evening. And I wanted to start out first by showing you what the document looks like if we print it out. So that's the entire document, the YOLO Habitat Conservation Plan and Natural Community Conservation Plan, second administrative draft. So this is still an internal working document for member agencies and the JPA. And believe it or not, this is double-sided, the whole thing. So we gave you quite a document to review for your very first commission meeting. And we tried to get it out to you as soon as we received it ourselves. We did not get the release until late in the day on March 31st. And so we tried to turn around the link and somewhat of an executive summary for you so that you could start reviewing it. Clearly tonight, we're not expecting that you have read that entire document and know every detail about it. Even staff, myself, who have read this in pieces as it was being developed, still are working my way through some of the various details and comments from the other advisory committee members. So I'll go ahead and start with the PowerPoint and kind of give you an overview and a little history. The city has been working on this plan. Basically, Yolo County has been working on conservation for well over 20 years. Towards a plan like this. The city joined the JPA and got really focused on going towards a habitat conservation plan in 2002. So there's a lot of history in this document. And you're coming in kind of at a major milestone. It's very significant. We haven't gotten to this level of a plan where staff feels this comfortable. It's taken 3 years. The last 3 years have been a significant effort. So I know Mayor Pro Tem Ledesma, who's the current chair of the YOLO Natural Heritage Program, JPA, he's our Mayor Pro Tem. He wanted to be here this evening. Unfortunately, he ended up with a conflicting meeting at Yolo County Transit District tonight. So he wanted me to give you the background on how long the city and the county and other agencies have been working on this document and stress the importance of the timeline that I'm going to be sharing with you. Your commission got formed after we had already committed to a review timeline for this second administrative draft. So tonight, really my focus will be on, whatever questions you have or whatever information you can give to me with respect to your recommendations to the City Council on some of the environmental policies in this plan. The Planning Commission is going to hear it later this week. They will look at it from more of the implementation project level. In other words, how is this going to affect development projects or public projects? That's the Planning Commission's role. So yours is really more geared towards a lot of the backbone policies that are contained within this habitat conservation plan, and I'll kind of go over a couple of those. So, okay, we have a PowerPoint presentation. I tried to limit the number of slides to about 10. I do have, after my presentation, I do have photos of the species, the 12 covered species, if you're interested in seeing those. So, the timeline I was referring to, kind of in the little bit of the background, this is a slide that's from the actual JPA, and they presented this to the City Council last fall. So here we are at the top left-hand side of the slide in March, April 2015, where we have the release of the second administrative draft. And basically, this is the time that we want to be commenting on this draft. If there are any fatal flaws in the environmental policies, if we think there are any implementation issues, because there would be an opportunity between, now and May 29th for the JPA to take a look at it, consider the comments from the member agencies, and determine whether or not they need to make changes before starting the EIR EIS. So once they start the environmental impact report, they're not going to entertain any further changes until they get through with that effort. So in August, September of this year, they're probably going to deliver to us a pre-public review draft of the plan, which hopefully that will incorporate any other comments that came through this effort. And then next year, summer, their target is to have the draft EIS, EIR out and the public review draft. So that's where it will go through the Office of Planning Research and be out for a full public review. And then they will move from there, incorporate any comments they get from the EIR, EIS, public review, and work towards the final of those documents, with the overall goal of the wildlife agencies issuing the final permit for this plan in late spring 2017. So, like I said in the beginning, this is the furthest we've gotten with trying to get to this point on this plan, and staff, we feel like we may actually get there finally. Any questions on the timeline? Okay. So an overview of what's contained in the plan. So the plan, the current draft is proposing to conserve 28,000, a little over 28,000 acres throughout Yolo County. There's over 60,000 acres in existing open space and agriculture that is currently protected but not formally managed. So Yolo County has actually done fairly well with their conservation and preservation just on their own, but we do want to try to move towards a more formal conservation plan and management. This draft contains 12 covered species. The prior draft that the former Agriculture and Natural Resources Commission saw back in 2013, that was the first administrative draft, that had 32 covered species in it. So this has been reduced to 12 covered species, primarily because there is some overlap in the benefit to the species, and the original plan was very expensive and was determined by the wildlife agencies as well as most member agencies to be infeasible to implement. And so pretty much everyone involved said we have to right-size the plan. And so that was a recommendation by the prior commission and also by the city council back in 2013, is to get the plan right-sized so that it can be successfully implemented. And so the 12 covered species is something that has been negotiated with the wildlife agencies, and the wildlife agencies so far are supportive of these species in this draft. What's not in this draft but will be coming, and I'm assuming that will be coming later this year, so I'll probably be back to you, or one of my staff will, is there is in the appendix, Appendix E, I believe, is the local conservation strategy. Right now, there's just a slip sheet in there that says to be coming in the future. I have seen a prior draft of that strategy, and at the time I saw it, it had at least 42 species of local concern. So as we have reduced the number of species, and originally back in 2004, I want to say, I think there was 72 covered species being entertained. So as the number of covered species in the permit plan has been reduced, those species have been moved over to the local conservation strategy, which is a completely separate strategy. It's not part of the permit. and it will have its own separate funding sources. So that's how we've tried to manage when we have reduced it down for the permit to 12 covered species. We didn't want to necessarily just abandon the other species that were of concern. So we've moved them into a different strategy, and we're very hopeful that those species will benefit from the actual formal permit plan, because they do have some shared communities, but that they also will be able to have their own strategy. So this plan that's before you in draft is estimated to be a little under 300 million in cost over the life of the permit, which is currently proposed at 50 years by the JPA and the member agencies. Now, to break that down, of that, about 238 million will come from mitigation. So that will come from projects that will pay fees, so then the habitat there will be a mitigation plan set up for those takes that occur development. And the development is primarily, I have a slide that will show you that is primarily in sort of the city boundary areas. So Yolo County has a very small development footprint given the size of the county. Then the other about 56 million is for conservation. So there will be other monies that come in either through grants, there's some local share money, and that will go towards actual purchase of conservation easements and management of those easements. Any questions on this slide?
I'm sorry, I actually do have a question.
Sure.
So on the conservation portion of this, are there funds that West Sacramento is planning to put toward conservation under this plan?
Nothing at this time has been identified. There are some other sources of funds that have been identified in other areas of the county. West Sacramento is going to be the biggest contributor of mitigation funds. That $238 million, a big chunk of that is us. But that is a good question, and that would be something that would be within your purview as the commission, as to give your opinions on whether or not to the city council on whether or not the city of West Sacramento should entertain some sort of local share towards conservation.
With the money going toward mitigation, would that then be applied anywhere within Yolo County, or would it need to have some proximity to West Sacramento?
It would be applied in Yolo County, and there's an actual strategy in the plan as to where those should be focused. And I have a couple slides coming up on that.
As far as the monies, and you're saying that the majority of it would come from West Sacramento?
A good portion of it, whoops.
Is it not split like between Woodland, Davis, and West Sacramento equally, or is that?
Well, it's driven by development. And so Davis has very little development expected to occur within their city. Winters has a little bit. Woodland has some with their Spring Lake development. But West Sacramento by far has the most area that is open for growth. We're not expanding our boundary. The city council made a decision as a part of this plan to limit to our existing city limits. So we're staying within our footprint, but we have a significant amount of square footage. Our plan throughout the city is very much geared towards smart growth, so we have a much higher density.
Is there a difference for the kind, and you may get into this later, so I'm happy to defer if it's more appropriate later, but is there a difference in the kinds of projects that the mitigation versus conservation dollars would pay for?
Well, mitigation has certain ratios depending on the species. And I believe the ratio for mitigation is 1.33. So for every acre you disturb, we need to mitigate at a 1.33 acres. And so that's what the mitigation dollars go towards. It could be buying into mitigation receiving sites. It could be forming mitigation banks. There's a variety of things that the plan outlines so far.
And then conservation dollars would,
Conservation goes more into, once those easements are established, then it's, the monies are for either maintenance of that easement, adaptive management measures. You can also use conservation monies for restoration, especially if part of your, if what a development is disturbing is riparian habitat or wetland habitat, you'll notice that the acreage, per cost acreage, is about 5 times higher than the base mitigation cost. And that's because those types of land cover types require complete restoration, conservation, and long-term maintenance.
Quick question, as far as the conservation restoration, are these outside the city limits? Or are there any areas within the city limits that are going to be targets for the restoration and conservation?
At this time, the majority of it is outside the city limits. It's possible that we may have a small area or two, like potentially a wetland area near the port. Or there could be some areas through the flood protection program, West Safka, some of the riparian area that they will be disturbing with their levee improvements, they're planning to self-mitigate, so they're planning to restore. But I don't know whether or not those would be able to go into actual conservation easements, because they will also have a flood protection easement across the top of them. So typically you can't layer those two easements together. But we will see. It's certainly something that the prior commission and city council has been somewhat open to. But I will say it hasn't necessarily been targeted, because our city is supposed to be the growth area. So that way we can conserve the rest of the county for agriculture and for these other high-value habitat areas. So frankly, SACOG kind of needs us to develop as an infill city and so that we don't end up with suburban sprawl elsewhere.
does this 28,000 acres include the already existing protected lands that we have within the county?
Only a small portion.
Okay.
We're only allowed to get credit for, I think right now, the negotiation is somewhere around 8,000 acres where we might get credit for some pre-existing conserved lands.
So most of this conservation money is then going toward newly mitigated areas
Yeah,
to
once
continue their maintenance.
Yes, there are some. First, there's like 3 categories. There's some that are already protected, but they're not in a formal management plan, so they want to go for those first and move, get them fully in a conservation strategy. Then the next are lands that are being managed in that function, but they haven't gone into formal easements yet, so they'll be going after that, and then there will be some new ones.
Thank you.
So this is figure 1. It comes from the plan, chapter 1. And this is showing you the footprint of the plan area, which is coincident with the Yolo County boundary. And where'd my mouse go? There we go. So the dark gray areas with the numbers, those are the cities primarily, and the numbers refer to our planning unit. So throughout the planning document, you'll notice that it'll talk about species exist in, planning units, 14, 15, 17, and 21, things like that. So that the numbers are the planning units to help you figure out where you're at in the document. The gray areas, where's my mouse? There we go. So West Sacramento is here, and we're shaded gray, which shows that we are expected to develop and that we are an incorporated area. And we are planning unit 21. The crosshatch area, which is fairly large, it's about, where'd my mouse, there we go. Sorry, the pointer keeps disappearing. So this crosshatch area here, that is the area that is proposed in the plan for conservation targeting. So it's a pretty significant area. That's also the area that has the most agriculture in it. And the habitat, this particular habitat and conservation plan is unique from some others that are in the region in that it allows cultivated lands as a part of the plan. That's very unique. The primary reason for that is a couple of the bird species really benefit from the cultivation of lands, specifically the Swainson's hawk, the white-tailed kite. They both, the alfalfa, the oat hay, those types of low-growing grassland-type crops are some of their prime foraging habitat. So that's the reason why cultivated lands are in here, and that's why primarily why the conservation target area is so large. The other species that benefits from the cultivation of lands is the giant garter snake. So rice habitat, especially the hedges along the edges, are really good habitat for the giant garter snake.
So what about vertical crops? I know I've ran into that issue with a bunch of other farmers that I've talked to, is that, vertical crops are not, that you can't cultivate vertical crops because of some of these birds. They dig down in the ground and catch mice, so is it gonna be for vertical crops or row crops? Like what kind of agriculture will we have in Yolo County?
Well, we'll still have a wide range of agriculture. But what we'll do is the plan proposes to have willing farmers who are willing to put their cultivations into conservation and management, that we will have some farmers that will partner in this. And Conway Ranch is a perfect example of one where they grow a variety of crops that are not only benefit to them as a farmer, but also as serving multiple species. So there's a way to do it and manage it. But a farmer will not be able to put, say, their land into a conservation easement if they have an orchard or if they're growing vineyards or hops. Those are not bird-friendly foraging habitats. So there will be limitations on what can be grown within those conservation easements.
But,
Go ahead.
but there is a sense that there are sufficient farmers who would be interested in being part of the conservation easements to be able to have enough mitigation lands to
So
account for
far,
the
yes.
development.
There's an advisory committee, which I sit on the advisory committee for the city of West Sacramento. On the advisory committee, we have Yolo County Farm Bureau representatives there. We have individual farmers there, and so their comments are reflected in this draft. They've helped develop the templates for the easements, so they have been at the table every step of the way.
So how does this affect the wine industry? Because I know Clarksburg is becoming bigger and bigger, and grape growers, grape farmers, vineyards. So is that one of those crops you mentioned that it's not good for the bird habitat? Does that fall under?
If someone wanted to put in a new vineyard and this plan was adopted, even right now, we have an agreement with the state of California Department of Fish and Wildlife for Swainson's hawk. It's a memorandum of understanding to where if we're converting Swainson's hawk foraging habitat for development and or for a vineyard, that they would have to mitigate for that. And the current fee, if you're disturbing 40 acres or less, or under 40 acres, I should say, is $8,660 per acre of disturbance. Bogle Winery down in Clarksburg. I had just toured down there. They had done some expansion, as you know. They have an area set aside. They decided to self-mitigate on their land, and they have an area set aside for Swainson's hawk foraging habitat that is not planted and probably will never be planted in vineyards. So that's some of the things that would occur. If a vineyard wants to go in that's greater than 40 acres, a new vineyard, then they would have to go purchase either mitigation bank credits or do some sort of off-site mitigation, still within the foraging area of the Swainson's hawk. Those are all great questions, by the way. So the covered activities in the plan, so these are the activities that, if this gets adopted, that will be, that we'll be able to implement under this, so there will be coverage for these types of activities. So one is urban development, so that would be the build-out of the cities, their general plans, specific projects. The other is infrastructure, which is, the city doing roadways, utilities, recreational improvements, flood protection. We have our entire levee system put in as a covered activity, and any future improvements they want to do to that, including a little bit south of our city, because that's within the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency's area of improvement. And then also Yolo County has included airport improvements, and then we've also put in Port of West Sacramento improvements, but not improvements that would occur in the water for the port. It's only the land-based improvements. Then this also covers facilities related to agriculture. So if they needed to do a new agricultural storage barn or something, that would fall within covered activities of this permit. The Yolo County has put in some aggregate mining in Cache Creek, so that would be a covered activity under this permit. And then ongoing operation and maintenance of infrastructure and the agricultural facilities, development, and the mining. And then, of course, the actual implementation of this plan in and of itself creates an impact potentially to the environment. So it has to be listed as a covered activity as well. And that would, an example of that would be going in and restoring, creating a new conservation area. It's going to disturb the existing habitat. So while it will create some, it will disturb some too. So it needs to be listed as a covered activity. If an activity is not listed and this plan gets adopted, then it's not going to be covered under this. So they would have to go, an activity would have to then go and seek its own individual permitting from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and also the state of California Fish and Wildlife. An example of that might be possibly the large wind generation. So those are very complex, and those right now, so far, have not been included, but there has been some discussion about that.
What proportion of anticipated activities over the next 50 years does this cover? Is this pretty much the entire landscape of what we're looking at right now for development and activities within Yolo County?
Yes. It covers all the city's general plans, everything that we could think of. But like I said, there's certain things that the advisory committee and the JPA board have chosen not to put in right now because it would have driven up the cost of the plan. And it would be also probably a little more controversial and complicated. We like wind generation, but it is not friendly to the birds.
And bats.
And the bats, yes.
As far as, you mentioned as far as this is only land-based activities, as far as the channel and port, I mean, that, there's considerable environment for species along either sides of the channel all the way down to the end of the counties. Is that not part of any of this?
It is part of it within Yolo County. but not in the water. This
Okay.
plan doesn't get into any in-water activities.
So the marshes and anything growing out and up the levees, anything in that area all the way down to Rio Vista, or not that far, but to the county line is part of this plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's within the Yolo County boundary, and it's from the high water mark up, then it's covered under this. So if there are levee improvements there, if the port does some dredging, and this doesn't cover the in-water dredging, but it would cover the spoils being placed on land.
Oh,
Okay?
Is there a reason it doesn't cover the in-water activity?
Again, that, it was talked about several years ago, and it was deemed to be significant in cost. So, and frankly, the port has its own EIR and process with regard to some of its in-water activities, kind of already in place. There's been oversight and discussions for years with the Corps of Engineers with respect to the annual dredging, and then, of course, the much more in-depth dredging. But that's not on the horizon, because we need to get some funding from the federal government to help do
that was my
that.
next question.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the covered activities that are in this current draft. Whoops. So covered species, I alluded to, there's 12. So this is the list of 12 and their status. This is straight out of the plan. So we have the palmate bract bird's beak. That is the only plant in the covered species. We have one invertebrate, which is the valley elderberry longhorn beetle. One amphibian, which is the California tiger salamander. Two reptiles, western pond turtle and giant garter snake. And then we have 6 birds, Swainson's hawk, actually 7 birds. Swainson's hawk, western yellow-billed cuckoo, western burrowing owl, least bell's vireo, bank swallow, tricolored blackbird, and the white-tailed kite. So of these 12, about half of these are known to occur in the city of West Sacramento, and most of them are the birds. Any questions on those?
Did you mention earlier that you had photos of these
Yes.
12?
Would you like to see those now?
Yes. I think so.
Oops. So I'm going to go past that. So this is the Swainson's hawk. And we have quite a few that return here and nest every year.
Just had one flying through my field.
I have had them come into my backyard. So, yeah.
Yeah, you can
Upper
see 'em
left.
along the levee.
Yeah, along the levee, yes, there's several nesting sites along the levee. We actually have a pair up in the Bridge District, right near the Tower Bridge, that come back every year. They apparently like baseball. They are not fazed by baseball or fireworks. There have been biologists out there watching them, and they seem to be fairly urbanized. So if you ever get a chance, kind of ballpark, the Universal Street, that's kind of the pedestrian pathway, bikeway that extends from Ballpark. It goes right up towards the Riverwalk. The tree that they come back to every year is right in that area.
No good seats for the ballpark.
Yeah. So upper left is western yellow-billed cuckoo. I don't think we have many of those. I have a map that will kind of show you. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'll try to point out a few. White-tailed kite. The current map in the plan doesn't show any occurrences in West Sacramento, but I do know that there have been occurrences. Nanette has actually had some very close experiences. But they apparently haven't been around of late, but I'm still including them as a potential occurrence in our city. for the future. Hopefully, they'll come back. Bank swallow, this is not one that occurs too often in our city. Least bells vireo, and then the tricolored blackbird we do have in the city. And this is a burrowing owl, and those we do have in the city. On the left is the plant, the palmate bract birdsbeak. We do not have this in the city, and this is actually, there's only one location in the county that this is known to occur. It's considered very critical habitat. And that's over by Davis. And then this is the valley elderberry longhorn beetle. So the beetle is what's protected, but because they depend on the valley elderberry for their habitat, that plant is protected as well. And we have quite a few dispersed around the city, the plants themselves. And then the western pond turtle we have in the city, and the tiger salamander we do not have in the city. And the giant garter snake, while there are some of our canals would appear to have habitat, or we could appear to have upland habitat, there has not been an occurrence of one found in the city. They tend to be more over on the western side of the Yolo bypass is the closest area they are to us. Pretty much the water that surrounds us is too deep and too swift moving for them to get across. So we don't get too many of these, or haven't had any of these actually, even though it looks like we have habitat for them. So going back, I want to go to this slide. So this is, there's a key on the left-hand side, and I know it's a little bit small, and I'll try to point out some things. But this top one is the tiger salamander. So you can see that the black diamond is primarily up in the northern, kind of central part of the county. Then the next one down is the Swainson's hawk, which is pretty much everywhere. So that's all these little yellow circles. That's the Swainson's hawk. So they're fairly dispersed all around the valley area of the county. This dividing line here is when you start getting up into the hills, so you're much more into the woodland hill area. The bank swallow is the pink, sort of pinkish purple circle. So the pinkish purple bank swallow, you've got a little bit over here along the river north of us, and then you also have some along the Cache Creek area. Burrowing owl is the orange circle. Note that we've got a few down around the bypass area. We have a couple right up here in the very northern part of our city around the Rivers neighborhood and the railroad tracks. Giant garter snake is the square. And there's nothing in close to our city, but see how there's a few over here along the western side of the bypass, right in here. They tend to hang around the rice again. Least bells vireo, which is the green little circle. We've got a small occurrence here. That looks like it's kind of around the railroad tracks, maybe in the Washington area. Maybe they like baseball too. And then the palmate bract beet, the plant, that is the turquoise circle. Let me see if I can find that one on here for you. That is right here, right in there, right? Actually, that is south. I said Davis before, but it's actually southeastern woodland. And that's the only known occurrence there. Then we have the tricolored blackbird, which is the other sort of black diamond. We have an occurrence here in the city that seems to be more over by the port. Valley elderberry, longhorn beetle is a larger circle, kind of orange. see we've got a few occurrences, one down south here along the river in Southport, another here in a little bit more northern portion of Southport, and then we've got a few up around the bend in the north part of the city. The western pond turtle, it's hard to see on this scale, but there is an occurrence. It's kind of overlapped, but there's an occurrence, I believe, down in Southport in some of that wetland area, maybe around Bees Lake. Then we also have the yellow-billed cuckoo, which is the pink square. That's down south of us, our city, probably more towards Clarksburg area or even a little further south. And then there's a few other occurrences in and around Davis. And then the last one is the white-tailed kite, and that is, for now, primarily around the Davis and bypass area. So that kind of covers the species dispersal.
Is this
And
all
now
from
you
the-
can see, pardon?
Oh, sorry. Is this all from the Natural Diversity Database? The CNDB?
Several databases.
Okay.
So it's, when the species occurrences were developed, it came from that database. It also was from actual surveys. There were several biologists who were specialists in each of these areas who helped determine the occurrences and try to bring them as most up to date as possible.
So in the memo that we received in preparation for this
Mhm.
meeting, one of the points mentioned that there's some discussion about whether or not to include the white-tailed kite in this list. And I was hoping that maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yes. So the white-tailed kite is the only fully protected species. In other words, under state law, you cannot take the species. So there was a question as to why should we be including it in the plan? But the plan, you have to have at least 11 species in order to be able to have a plan like this. That's the bare minimum number of species to cover. And the palmate bract beaks, the plant, there is some question as to whether or not it is going to be able to be preserved. So it's possible that the wildlife agencies say that we don't think it's going to be able to make it. You know, that you're choosing to preserve something that may not be feasible. And so we took the white-tailed kite off, and then we put it back on in order to, just in the event that the plant falls off in our negotiations, that we would have the white-tailed kite. The focus on the white-tailed kite would be more about expanding its population in our city, as opposed to listing it on here so that it could be taken. That's not the point of this. The point would be more to try to grow the population in the county.
And if the palmate bracted bird's beak were to fall off of this list because it's deemed not able to be protected to the extent that, does it still have the federal and state protections as being
Yes.
an endangered species?
And and there is a current recovery plan for it. But it's so limited here, and it's listed as critical habitat as well. So it's not likely to be disturbed anyway. That's one of those that, because it's so critical, we would want to apply avoidance measures before we do anything. So there will be a lot of effort put into that. So that the white-tailed kite was more of a fail-safe in the event that through the negotiations with the wildlife agencies, it came off the list, that we would still have 11 species.
Was there varying numbers of takes that are allowed per species that's on this list?
Well, yeah, there is an estimate of what would be taken based on the covered activities.
Okay.
So we've already, each of the member agencies have already kind of identified what is our disturbance footprint, and then they overlay that we can overlay that in the GIS system with where the species occurrences are, and we can determine approximately the takes that would occur.
Okay.
throughout
So
the county.
where the fracking deep is,
That's currently planned for if I'm not mistaken, I think the county or the county and Woodland are working on a potential preservation area for that. But it hasn't been formalized yet. Any further questions on the occurrences? So on this map, you can kind of see why the boundary kind of ended up being chosen for the targeted conservation area, because that has the most species occurrences in it. And these other areas where there are species, I have another slide here that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Let me see if that's the next one. No, it's the one after this one. So this slide is figure 5.53, which is out of chapter 5, and this shows you what the current public and easement lands, what currently exists in the county. So this is what the county has been able to achieve without any formal plan, just on their own policies. So we do have a fair amount in the bypass. Conway's up here. There is a fair amount over in the Pewta Creek and the Cache Creek areas, and a little bit up by Zamora over in this area. So that's what currently exists. Again, some of these, see the 3 categories here. So the category 1 is they are in an easement and they are being managed. Then category 2 is not, they're lacking that formal management. And then category 3 is just the practices alone. They are achieving some of the results that we want, but we want to try and get those into the formal plan.
And I know you said this earlier, but how many acres does this currently cover for our current existing public easement lands?
Current public easement lands, let me see.
I'm trying to get a sense of scale for what the additional roughly 30,000 acres would look like above and beyond what we currently have.
Right. That number has changed because it changes with negotiation. So there's actually more than the 8,000. The 8,000 is what they're willing to give us some credit for. And I'm trying to find it in that summary.
Is that the 90,000?
Pardon?
Is that the 90,000 acres? No.
It probably
What we currently
is.
have.
It's a pretty large number, but the wildlife agencies will not allow us to have credit for that.
Okay.
So we're only getting a very small credit for what we already have in permanent preservation.
And then my follow-up question to this is, as we're planning the new conservation areas, are we taking into account their proximity to existing public easement lands for facilitating species movement within those lands? And
That is a perfect segue into my next slide.
great.
So, ecological corridors. That is a significant policy change from where this plan originally started. It was originally just focused on the species. And when I came on to the advisory committee 3 years ago, that was a significant discussion around the committee. It was that, we can list all these various species and try to protect them, but if we don't recognize the connection in their movement and their relationship to each other and their habitats, that we're still just not quite getting to where we should be with a habitat and conservation plan. And so there was a conscious effort to really change the focus of the plan to approach it more from the ecological corridors. And so I'll walk you through some of them. There's the Sacramento River corridor. There is the Yolo Bypass corridor. There is the Pewta Creek corridor and the Cache Creek corridor. And the Cache Creek corridor actually could even extend up even further, but this gets up into the woodlands, woodland areas. And so the species concentration drops off up into the heavy woodland areas. So when the advisory committee and others were working on this plan, they really started looking at the species that use these corridors or that their habitats benefit from these corridors. And so that's where we've come over the last 3 years with this plan.
And so the 12 species that are focused are all within, or primarily have habitat within those areas, so that as we
Yes.
think about where we're
And
mitigating
or
land.
benefit from those corridor areas. So the the Swainson's hawk has habitat all over, and Pewter Creek and Cache Creek and the Sacramento River does provide habitat for them, but that's not their primary foraging area. But it has trees along it that they like to nest in. And so that's what we talk about. It may not be their foraging habitat, but it might provide their nesting habitat. Or maybe, it provides water to plants that benefit some other species. So there's a kind of the domino effect or the chain of relationship that the corridors provide. So that kind of is a high-level overview. Let me see if there's anything else that I missed from my notes here that I wanted to cover tonight. So there are a couple things. A little bit of going back just a little bit, the prior commissions in the Ag and Natural Resources Commission in 2013 and 14, there was a big question about the value of this type of plan. And the prior commission felt that it had value, because there was a big question at that time, given the cost, whether we wanted to continue to participate in it. And so we've moved beyond that. The decision was made to continue. And staff recommendation is to keep moving. We think this plan is finally something that is realistic, feasible. We think it will be a benefit to our community. And the benefits that we see from a staff level and prior commission had commented on is that right now, projects that come forth, whether they're public or private, the mitigation and the conservation is on a project-by-project basis. It's sort of a piecemeal approach. There's uncertainty for development and even for the city when we do projects. An example of some of the uncertainty we face and some of the cost and timeliness under where we're at currently is in the Bridge District. We had a very large project going on, infrastructure project, a couple years back, you might remember if you were in the city, where we had about $58 million worth of work we were doing over there. And one of the items was a sewer pump station and a force main that was right underneath the freeway. Well, underneath the freeway, there was a valley elderberry bush. No evidence of beetles that we could see, but the bush was there. And we had a very limited area where we could put the sewer force main based on connectivity with other sewer pipelines. And so we had put in a request, a permit application to remove that elderberry bush. And it went to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we checked in regularly. And finally, we were coming up on a critical point in the project because we had a timeline with the state under that grant. It had a very large Prop 1C grant, and we had to have all the infrastructure done in 2 years. And that was a lot of infrastructure to do in 2 years, $58 million worth. And the contractor was saying, hey, we have to get this sewer in, or we're going to start bumping up against deadlines. 8 months, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife hadn't even looked at the permit application. It had sat on their desk because they were so busy with other activities that they couldn't get to ours. So we met with them and said, what are our options? At this point, we're in a very critical need, and they said, well, we're not going to get to it for another 6 months. Your best bet is to avoid the bush. And we had to get back with our contractor, and the only way we could avoid it is we had to bore underneath it. And we had to go so deep underneath it to make sure that we didn't disturb the bush. That cost the city about $175,000 more for one bush, and we had a delay of about 8 months. Fortunately, it didn't affect the final outcome of the project other than the cost. We still stayed on schedule. But having this plan in place, if we'd have had this plan in place at the time, then we could have gone underneath the covered activity and through this permit that this plan would create, and we would have been able to take that bush out, maybe transplant it somewhere else, or plant others somewhere else that would be in a protected area. And we would have not lost the 8 months, and it would have cost us a lot less than $175,000. So that, plans like this give certainty to development. It's an organized approach to conservation and mitigation. And then, you know, you're dealing more at the local level with an agency as opposed to the federal and state level, trying to work through issues like that. So that's kind of some of the benefits. There are some other benefits that have been identified. The Supervisor Villegas at a recent Yolo County Board of Supervisors meeting said that he felt there are potential community benefits from partnerships with the Lower Pewta Creek Coordinating Committee and the Cache Creek Resources Management Plan that will result in the restoration and protection of those riparian habitats combined with some recreational opportunities, passive recreation opportunities like hiking and walking and things. And he felt that there would be similar opportunities for us along our Sacramento River. And so we might be able to partner with those committees or those groups and possibly have them help us with some restoration and passive recreation opportunities. So that came from Supervisor Villegas. So what's within the purview tonight of this commission is to give me feedback on what you've read so far, what you've heard from me, as far as any of the environmental policies related to this plan. So I noted in this agenda report that there's still negotiation going on about the term of the plan. Currently, we're proposing 50 years. The wildlife agencies continue to push for 40 years. That's significant, and that would be something that I'd like to see what this commission, if this commission agrees with staff or has some other ideas. 50 years is the maximum they will go. The reason why staff is not recommending 40, we continue to push back on that, is that 10 years prior to the end of the plan, you have to show that you've made substantial progress and that you are going to complete all the conservation and mitigation acreage. So if we sign on to this and it gets approved, the city and all the other member agencies are committing that we will produce all these acreages, even if the development doesn't occur. And SACOG, when we went to SACOG and we said, hey, what is your latest estimate on the build out of the cities in Yolo County? And that was 2 years ago, and they said 42 years. 42 years is what the blueprint model is showing, that the cities in Yolo County would build out. Well, there's an effort underway right now to recognize that we're coming off of a significant economic downturn. And build out hasn't occurred like we thought it would. And so we were just at the council, we being staff was at the council, and brought an item to the council on kind of dialing back. We went back through our general plan process and also through the SACOG process, and looked at what development has occurred and what do we think is actually going to build out in the next 20-year planning horizon for the SACOG model. And we've dialed it back. So that effort's still ongoing, but I wouldn't be surprised if the next time when SACOG gets that model, gets all the inputs from all the other communities and they rerun the model, I wouldn't be surprised if our build out pushes out a little further to 45 years. So that's why the member agencies have been hesitant, because we don't think, we pretty much know that we don't see us getting fully built out or close to it within 30 years. So that's one item. The other item that seems to be a policy-related negotiation is the wildlife agencies are asking for almost 1,000 acres of additional wetland restoration, even though it won't be because of a disturbance. They're just saying, why don't you throw in an extra 1,000 acres of wetland restoration? Wetland restoration, as you know, the fee, if you disturb a wetland, is over $60,000 an acre. So it's very expensive. So staff has questioned whether or not that's hurting the plan by adding more cost to the plant. It's already almost a $300 million plan. And we'd hate to see it start adding more cost into it. So I'm curious about this commission's thoughts on that one. And then any other sort of environmental policy items that you might have noted that you'd like to pass on to the city council? So the next steps, Planning Commission this Thursday, they'll be looking at it more from the project entitlement. I will let them know what your comments were. Then we will be going to the City Council on May 20th, and we will present both your comments and the Planning Commission's comments. And then the City Council will direct staff, hopefully, to compile comments for the city to formally submit by the May 29th deadline, and that we have to submit directly to the JPA board. So that concludes my presentation. And
Quick question, as far as what arguments are they using for the 40-year plan to support their contention to cut 10 years off of it?
That it's more common, that the other plans that they have done in other areas range from 30 to 40 years. So this one is a little more lengthy, so it's not as common.
To what extent do those plans cover a similar acreage or have a similar projection for build-out?
They might have a similar projection for build-out. They might cover the same acreage. What they don't cover is cultivated lands.
Did you say that all of the other member agencies are also supportive of a 50-year plan as opposed to a 40-year plan, or is there some split among them?
I'm not aware of any split. I haven't heard any yet. So far, the member agencies have been supportive of the 50 years.
Has a plan of this type covered cultivated lands before?
Not that I'm aware of.
Correct me if I'm wrong, did you say earlier that this plan would instill a little bit more of, I guess, a formal monitoring and management program within all the policies being recommended?
Yes, it
Can you
is an
elaborate?
actual requirement of the plan, and there is an entire chapter on management and how that will be practiced. It's proposing to use the adaptive management, if you're familiar with that process, where you take your best practices and you put them in place. That's known in the industry for that particular species or area that you're conserving. And then if you're not getting you're not seeing the stabilization of the species, or you're not getting the restoration or the growth that you anticipated, then you go and you adapt some things, and then it's kind of like try again until you get it right. But that's all done in coordination with the wildlife agencies. So this plan, once it's adopted, the JPA right now is the one negotiating with the wildlife agencies, and they're the ones that are developing this plan. We're just providing input to it. If it gets adopted and permitted, then the roles will change slightly. The JPA becomes sort of the administrator of the plan, and the member agencies become the permittees. So then we will be the ones interacting with development. We will be the ones reviewing that and issuing permits to them, collecting the fees. Those then get passed on to the JPA for implementing. The JPA will then be the one not only administering, making sure we're meeting the targets, following the rules of the plan, but then they will also be overseeing and coordinating the purchase of conservation, the management of the easements, and the formal reporting. And then the wildlife agencies will be overseeing it as well.
What percentage of the development needs to have occurred before that 10-year threshold, that last 10 years?
You have, trying to remember offhand without having to dig through the book. In other words, at that point, they're going to check to see if you've met certain thresholds. For sure, you have to be, I think, at least 50% onto the targets.
How does that
There is a
align with
number
our-
defined in there where they'll be looking at.
How does that align with our general plan in terms of?
The 50-year, if we can maintain the 50-year permit term, I think it will align well. Because again, I think our full build-out is projected somewhere around 42 to 45 years at this point. And so, at the 40-year mark, we will know at that point whether we're going to be pretty close.
And what happens if you don't hit that target? What are the consequences?
Well, even if we don't build out, we still have to conserve that acreage. So we would then have to go look for other funding sources and go out and purchase acreage.
As West Sacramento being one of the largest contributors or projected contributors, would we
Yes.
be on the hook for the most amount of?
It's a shared,
Okay.
it'll be a shared thing. It'll actually be a responsibility of the JPA, which all the members will share in that. If for some reason we don't, something happens and say we can't build out, but maybe Winters has suddenly an area that they want to expand. There's something new that happened in Winters. We could transfer our development, that capacity to them. Even though they might not have shown that footprint at the time this was adopted, there could be an exchange. So there is that ability to do that. But again, that would have to be reviewed and approved by the JPA as well as the wildlife agencies, because that would be a slight
SACOG
amendment.
play into that?
Pardon?
Would SACOG play into that at all too? in terms
Oh,
of-
possibly, yeah. Yeah, if it was something that affected the blueprint, sure.
Now, what if you were able to finish the plan before the 50 years is planned? What happens then? Do we
Then
look to?
you're full on into just the management at that point. Then we will be a success.
And then would new development projects have to go through the entire EIR, CEQA, NEPA process on their own outside of what's already being done under this plan?
No, that's another benefit of this plan. Very good point. That's another streamlining aspect, is if a project is consistent with our general plan, then, and they're listed as a covered activity in here, then they would be covered under this, and they wouldn't need to do any additional CEQA.
And that's true even after the 50 years, or is that only during the 50 years?
Now, after the 50 years, that's a good question. I don't know if that's actually come up yet. That's a good one. I was going to say, after the 50 years, and if it was outside the footprint, definitely. You know, then there would have to be potentially an individual process, or possibly another plan gets developed.
So some of that, the mitigation funds would actually be offset by the fact that they don't have to go through the EIR, or do they still have to go through an EIR process, but not
Yeah,
CEQA?
they still have to do CEQA for their project,
Okay.
but the area under biological would say, there's a plan in
okay,
place,
okay.
your mitigation would be following this plan.
Okay.
Would those CEQA plans have to take into consideration species that are not addressed under this plan?
Yes.
Okay. And then how do the local concern species fit into all of this?
Like I said, that would be a separate strategy, and it would have to find its own funding. So it's possible, if that gets some movement and it goes through kind of establishing itself as its own strategy, and if it then goes through the environmental process for itself, you know, I could foresee maybe that becoming something where development could utilize that strategy and that plan as a way to mitigate for the other species that are not covered under this. But that strategy needs a lot more work. At this point, it's just a strategy, and it has its own focus group working on that. It's got a couple, it's got a biologist from UC Davis. Yolo Audubon Society is playing a role in that, as well as California Native Plant Society.
Has there been any analysis for the overlap of those species of concern with the 12?
Yes,
How much overlap?
quite a bit. The species of
I'm
local
sorry, for
concern.
the areas that are not Swainson Hawk areas that are more targeted.
There still is quite a bit of overlap. A lot of species of local concern are plants.
Okay.
And so those are dispersed all over. Of the species of local concern, like I said, I haven't seen the latest draft. And I know they've been moving, as things drop off the covered species from the plan, they move them into the local species of concern. And I haven't seen the latest, so I can't really tell you how many are in our city. But I think the last time I saw it, it was maybe 4. And again, a lot of plants are on that one, and we don't have as many of the plants. We seem to be a little more isolated that way.
So as the climate changes over the next 50 years, if we come to find out that one of these 12 species, or we have to have 11 species to have this plant, but one of the species we can't save them, it's costing us too much. Now they can't be part of that plan. Is that something, what's built into that?
Once they're in the plan, they're in the plan.
They're in the plan. But
Yeah.
what if we can't save them?
Well, we have to try. And actually, climate change is part of the analysis in the EIR for this plan. So climate change is a factor that has to be discussed with these species and how sensitive they are to climate change. Water availability is another one. Giant garter snake needs water for their habitat. And so with this drought, water availability is a consideration. So that too will be discussed in the plan. What are the measures if we get into a very severe drought situation, kind of like the one we're in now? How will we get water to areas that have been put into permanent conservation for giant garter snake?
So that might increase the cost going forward in this project.
It could.
So what happens at that point? Does it come back to raising the mitigation fees, or?
It's possible, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a provision to allow for that to occur if a need, you know. That would have to go to each of the member agencies, the JPA, you know, Fish and Wildlife, both agencies there. So,
So are the mitigation fees the same regardless, or within a certain development type? So all road expansions would have the same mitigation fee applied to them?
it depends on the land cover type that they're disturbing. So the base fee is a little over 10,000 an acre. So that's covering 12 species, where right now, our developers pay $8,660 for one species per acre. So it's, to us, the fee seems reasonable. When you look at other HCPs in the area, some of their per acreage fees are a lot higher, but many times they're covering more species as well. And then there's the riverine habitat and the wetland habitat. So those are the other, there's 3 other per acre fees, or 2 other per acre fees, and they go much higher because of the need for restoration in those 2 land cover types. So it is possible that a development could end up having some portion of the project have an acreage that's the base fee, and then if they touch like one of the riverine habitats or a wetland area, then they might have whatever acreage they're disturbing in that be at a different fee per acre. And that would all be broken down.
Is there a reason why that upper finger of Cache Creek wasn't included? Because it seemed like there was some swallow and other.
Primarily because development or
Just not gonna
disturbance
happen there.
isn't anticipated in there. That's already kind of a protected area based on the Yolo County's general plan policies, not to allow development up in the hills
And the
along
aggregate
Cache
mining
Creek.
was further down.
That's
towards
down,
the-
yeah, that's actually where current aggregate mining is going on.
So you said the wildlife agencies want to possibly add another 1,000 acres on top of everything for wetland restoration, is that correct?
Yes, there's been a recent request by them to add about, it's 900 and change acres of wetland restoration
Mhm.
into the plan, even though there's no plans to disturb that. So we've questioned why. It adds more cost if we're not disturbing it. So we'd rather have it say, if we disturb, we will do that.
Mhm.
But if we don't, then no.
So
Have they-
for restoration, you would need more water for the wetlands?
Potentially. Depends on where it's located and the soil type and whether there's an existing water source there.
Have the wildlife agencies justified why they want the additional 981 acres besides just, we think wetlands are a useful habitat?
I have not heard what their justification is. So far, I've only seen what was put in the transmittal memo from the executive director of the JPA.
Are you aware of any ballpark, estimates or projections on what the additional cost might be on top of the almost 300 million?
Well, if you figure about 60,000 an acre, and they want about 1,000 acres, so about another, what,
60 million.
60
Yeah.
million?
So if that were to get included, would that result in an increase in the mitigation fees that are being paid out? Would that come from a separate fund? Is there a strategy for?
It wouldn't be included in the mitigation fees, because if we weren't planning to disturb, we wouldn't show that. So it would be just pure conservation.
How often are you guys gonna have checks and balances, like a checkpoint when there's, what's happening with this money? What are we doing? What are some of the successes and what are failures? How often will we know about these
That would be on an annual basis.
on an annual basis?
Yeah. Yeah, the JPA has to go through annual auditing with their finances as well as any plan like this, so. And they may even have more check-ins than that I'm not aware of, but I do know for sure, even through the development of this plan, there has been annual auditing.
When's the majority of I'm sure there's projections that the development's not linear, there's gonna be kind of curves and according to different plans. What does that kind of look like? Is the majority, is it occurring in the next 10 years and then sort of, or how?
You know,
Is that-
development is a little tough to predict out
Sure.
50 years.
Yeah. But just in terms of like general plans that the different cities have put out in terms of,
Even amongst the cities, it's different.
yeah.
So we've been on a pretty steady increase in our growth. The other cities haven't quite seen that return like we have. In fact, we've been leading the region a little bit on our return. We're starting to level off just a little bit. And when I say level off, meaning not level, but as far as our steep increase, it's starting to adjust a little bit. So, the past couple of years, we've been on like a 20 to 30% increase in development each year. I'm projecting over the next 2 years that that's kind of going to slow down just a little bit, and probably only be at a rate of 5 to 8%. But I tend to be a little conservative. And I think we're going to keep seeing that because with infill, we tend to be an infill development community with our proximity to downtown Sacramento. And so we're seeing different generations want to have kind of the lifestyle that we have, the opportunities we have here in West Sacramento. So I think we're going to continue to see growth, but I think there will be cycles. And over my career, I have seen cycles of about 10 years, where there will be a period of growth and then there will be a leveling off, there will be an adjustment, maybe a slight decline. Hopefully we never go through the downturn that we just went through, at least not that significant. But I think you're going to see some cycles about every 10 years where there will be some slight adjustments. But I think overall, for our region, it will be, if you drew a line to average out those cycles, it would still be in a positive growth direction.
So, from what I recall, there's like about 9,000 housing units going in the Southport, like southern Southport, sort of southeast portion of between.
Yeah, there's
Liberty
two
and
projects
all that
that
stuff.
were approved back in 2008, Yarborough and River Park. Those two combined, if you go with what their original approvals were for their targeted number of units, those were about 5,500 units. Then we have the Liberty project, which is north of Davis Road and south of Linden Road, about 350 acres along the river. That's currently in process for its planning entitlements and is tracking with the general plan update as far as timeline. I think they're proposing about, the latest count, I want to say 1,700 to 1,900 units, so 2,000 maybe.
Yeah.
And then the Stone Lock area up by the Barge Canal has the potential for another 1,000 to 2,000, depending on that land use plan. So yeah. It's around 9,000 if they build out at target densities.
If they, what is their projected, so when they apply for these permits, are they going to meet the deadline for?
I believe they will, yes. That's in our projection of
Oh, sorry, I
the
meant,
42 to 45 years.
That's not what I meant, are those developments going to be paying into this mitigation fee system? Are they going to be in
Yes.
place prior or after?
No, I believe this plan will get adopted before
Okay,
they get close to doing any sort of building.
okay. So
So
we'll
All
get a
of
chunk
those projects, even Yarborough and River Park, what they have are their land use approvals.
Mhm.
They have not applied to subdivide the property at all. They still have to negotiate a financing agreement with the city. So there's probably another, I would say, 5 years of mapping, backbone infrastructure work, financing plans and things to work through with them before they get anywhere near actually going vertical with construction.
Because those are going to be some of the larger projects that will contribute to this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so along with that, we'll start seeing revenue to apply toward our mitigation efforts relatively early in the 40 or 50-year period of this plan because of developments that are already sort of in the pipeline right now.
Yes, I think those will, well, right now, there's mitigation dollars already flowing towards the JPA for the Swainson's Hawk. West Sacramento has contributed quite a bit of money through mitigation dollars into the Swainson's hawk habitats that exist today. So there's already money flowing, but yeah, these projects, they will be contributing, but they'll probably lag a little, they might not come online until maybe year 10 of this, to where we start seeing, or I shouldn't say maybe not quite that far out, maybe year 6 to 7, we'll start to see some of those projects flow into this. But those two are very large projects, Yarborough River Park, Liberty, I wouldn't expect them to build out until maybe year 30, given where they're at today. Our average absorption of residential units in a normal market is around, in the Southport area, is about 200 to 300 units a year. So when you're talking about 5,500 or 7,000 units, it's going to take some time.
And so is that one of the rationales for why the 50 years is a better timeline for us? Because to get the money from our current developments to mitigate these 28,000 acres, we're not getting that money starting day one of our 50-year term. It's the 5 years in, 10 years in, 30 years in as these developments progress.
Correct.
Any more questions, or? Thank you very much. Is there?
So is it then that this commission supports staff's recommendation to the council that the 50-year term, we should continue to try to maintain that term?
All those-
Yes.
Yes? All those in favor?
Yes.
Yeah.
What about the additional wetland restoration that the wildlife agencies have asked for? Does the commission have any opinions on that?
It'd be interesting to see from the wildlife groups what their reasoning
Yeah.
behind it.
Asking for $60 million, why are they asking for an extra $60 million investment? What exactly is the reason?
Okay.
But
That
not
would be nice to
necessarily-
know.
Yeah, because unless it's actually, acreage is actually taken, disturbed or something, then what would be the point? And then there's no plans for it. This would only be as a result of actual disturbing of those acreages. I don't see the need.
Well, I think there's need
Well, I mean,
for
as far as-
developing
yeah.
wetlands.
Well, there is need for the wetlands, but as far as not having it in the plan, if there's no, currently, there's no plan to disturb those 1,000 acres.
I would just like to hear what their reasoning is for it, not necessarily that I'd be for it, but just what is their thinking on that as to, is that something that's common in other plans? Is that?
I think it's probably a negotiation.
Okay.
It's like anything else. For example, I'll use a development example. We, the city, when we're negotiating development agreements, we try to get the best terms that serve our city the best. Higher quality development, and, more amenities out of the development to serve the community. So I could surmise that maybe the wildlife agencies are trying to, get as much as they possibly can for the environment in Yolo County.
It
You
seems like
mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
You mentioned that they asked for this relatively recently, though, right?
Yes,
How recently, after the first draft had been completely done and?
actually probably within the last month or two, because the first I saw it was in that memo. It wasn't brought up at the last advisory committee meeting that I'm aware of.
That seems to me just sort of unusual then to ask for an extra 20% of the 300 million that the total is, sort of at the last minute. And I agree that, preserving wetlands is of course very important, but I think I agree that I'd like to hear a bit more justification from
Yeah, it'd be
them
nice to
about
see a little bit
why,
more detail about
sort of
it.
at the last minute, I asked for that much more.
Is it common in these type of negotiation, in these type of plans? that they wanna-
Yes, yeah.
It seems like.
There's been quite a few terms that have been put in and taken out over the last couple of years.
It seems strange that you have you're putting in place a more unified approach to protecting these species. That in itself is kind of, you're providing, you're paying attention to the different, it just seems to me like it's interesting that you, as a wildlife group, you would be for this, and you wouldn't be sort of trying to push the boundaries of what you're getting. I mean, I understand it.
Yeah.
But-
You know, in defense of the wildlife agencies, they have been very much at the table and working with us very well over the last couple of years. They really want to see this plan
Yeah,
succeed.
that's what I would.
So there must be some other part of the conversation that I'm not privy to yet. And maybe I'll find out more at the April 27th JPA board meeting, because there's going to be a full presentation on the plan there. And you all, as commissioners, that is an open board meeting you can attend. If more than the majority of you attend, I would suggest you sit separately and not talk amongst yourselves, because this is an item that's before you. We want to be cognizant of the Brown Act. But you can attend, and prior Ag and Natural Resources Commissioners have attended JPA board meetings when there's been significant items up.
Has there been any indication that the wildlife agencies are interested in helping to pay for this? Or is the sense that this is entirely on the local agencies in JPA to cover?
That was sort of a negotiating position that we took, is if they wanted to try to keep that in and place it upon us, even if we didn't disturb it, that we'd be happy to do it if they pay for it. I don't know what their response was to that.
Or if they even paid for the majority of it. I mean, I think that there's definitely places to negotiate there if that's a place that they want to go with this. The other question I had with regards to this is, are all of our other mitigation efforts essentially a same land for the same land? So if you affect wetlands, you have to create new wetlands, or is there flexibility for land types in the mitigation throughout the plan?
No, you pretty much have to mitigate for the covers that you disturb.
Okay, because
There is some slight overlap in between some of the covers, but not so much when you get into the wetlands.
Okay, because you'd made a comment or the suggestion to use the language of, if we affect the wetlands, then of course we're going to, then yes, we would restore
Yes.
new wetlands elsewhere. But it sounds like that's already covered in the scope of the rest of the plan.
Yes.
As currently written. Okay.
We were talking about the wind farms.
Yes.
Where, I would imagine they were looking at kind of in that area where it wasn't covered, more in the foothill.
Yeah, that would be, it's not in the targeted conservation area. Yeah, it's along the hills west of Dunnigan, where I think there's been some exploration of wind generation, potential wind generation farm, but again, that has a whole range of issues with it, so. At this point, it is not a covered activity in the plan, but it is still being discussed.
But there's not like a major area that's people are looking at to.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any proposed projects at this point in time.
Was solar included in?
Solar as a large utility generation, I don't think it's included at this time, but that is another one that's being looked at. But that too has impacts to a lot of the bird habitat.
So just a question on timeline. I know you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to make sure that sort of we're clear. The draft that's leaving us today is essentially what's going to be used after consideration of comments to sort of scope the EIR moving forward. And so will there be additional opportunities for us to comment on this draft in response to some of the questions that we're raising? Or if we come back and they say 40 years is definitely what we have to do for us to have a conversation about what does that look like in meeting the goals of this for West Sacramento? Will there be opportunities for additional comment on this?
Yes. So when the public review draft comes out, along with the EIR-EIS, there will be another opportunity. What we're trying to do in this draft is point out any fatal flaws that we try to capture now before we go to the expense of preparing an EIR-EIS and then having to go have something come up that causes us to have to redo that work. That's what we're really trying to avoid here. And also trying to provide comments that assist the JPA in negotiating the actual plan.
So in that vein, I have one last comment, question. For the choice of the 12 species, you had mentioned that when new projects come up and they have to prepare their EIRs, that under the biological section, they can say, see this plan, we've already accounted for mitigation for these species. Of current plans that are going through, do these 12 species account for 50%, 75%, 90% of the biological impacts that are identified under EIRs and EISs?
You know, I don't have a good handle on that with respect to comparing to other HCPs and NCPs that have been adopted. I know there's a fair amount of comparison to the Contra Costa County plan with this plan. But again, the biggest difference between those two plans is that we have cultivated lands, and cultivated lands is actually prohibited in their plan.
Because I ask in the sense of making sure that these are the right 12 species to have in this plan. And I know that there have been lengthy years and years of discussions narrowing down these species, but to make sure that we're striking the right balance between protecting the species that we have and making sure that they have the right habitats, but also making sure we're targeting the right species to streamline for our broader development projects.
I can tell you that the wildlife agencies feel that these are the right 12 species. And that by having this plan and mitigating and protecting and restoring these species in our area will have benefits way beyond these 12 species. There's a lot of overlap in the habitats for these 12 species with other species of local concern. And so that's why this plan, as we've tried to right-size it and get it into something that's actually going to be successful to implement, that all of those overlaps and needs were considered. And that's kind of how we ended up with these particular 12.
Any more questions?
So in general, the commission, would you say from an environmental policy that the plan has the right focus on the ecological corridors and?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Are we in agreement? Yes.
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 Well, and I think the movement toward ecological corridors is really a great direction for the plan to be taking. And I think I'm glad to see that evolution to where it is now. And
All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I know this was an extremely large document, and you got it in a very short time frame. And in the future, when this does come back before you, we will get it out to you as quickly as possible for advance review. All right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No.
So at this point in the meeting, this is where if the staff had anything to communicate to the commission, we would do that.
Oh, okay.
The only thing I wanted to bring up was the next meeting is June 8th. I also, it occurred to me that any events the city is having that that this commission may want to attend. We'll send that out via email with the dates and times and who the contact person is. I thought about that while we were here, so sorry about that, but we'll get that straightened out. The chair can adjourn whenever,
Oh, so,
unless there's any other comments.
just what?
Unless there's any other comments, the chair can adjourn.
Any comments? If not,
Looking forward
I
to
just-
working with all you guys.
yeah, I'm looking
Yeah.
forward very much to
Yeah.
working with all of you.
Yeah, and I want to thank all the staff who presented today
Yeah.
for their very in-depth review of the topics that we discussed. It's, for me, this is my first meeting, and it was a pleasure to get to see all of
Yeah.
that, so.
I think it's the first for every one of us,
Yeah.
yeah. So, without knowing, we're going to adjourn or put it up for,
You
I
can, you can adjourn.
okay, I guess we're going to adjourn.
You have to make a motion.
Oh,
and somebody has to second.
Somebody make a motion.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, there we go.